This adventurous story begins by showing a boy named Eek, who used to be very happy with his girlfriend, Maren. But within just a few days, Maren dies under mysterious circumstances. No one had any idea who murdered Maren. Eek was completely shocked upon hearing about his girlfriend's murder. However, people around him started saying that Maren's murder was committed by none other than her own boyfriend, Eek. Even though they had no evidence, they began to raise their voices against him. Eek refused to believe these accusations because he loved Maren deeply and could never think of killing her. The situation escalated to the point where several reporters gathered around Eek's house to get a statement from him, demanding to know why he had killed his girlfriend. At this moment, Eek was in such a state that he didn't want to reply to anyone. Instead, he left and went straight home. His entire family was supporting him, believing that he had done nothing wrong. However, Eek's father had doubts and suspected that Eek might have committed the murder. This deeply hurt Eek because he relied on his family's support during this critical time. Furious and heartbroken, he stormed out of the house. Outside, Eek was sitting with his brother, Brian, when their friend, Lee, arrived. Lee was a lawyer handling Eek's case. However, Lee brought terrible news: all the evidence that had been gathered against Eek had been destroyed in a fire. The laboratory where this crucial information was stored had been set on fire and reduced to ashes. Now, Eek was utterly terrified because if no proof remained, everyone would assume he was the killer. Inside, he was completely broken. Brian tried to comfort his brother, assuring him that everything would be fine and that he just needed to stay positive and move forward. Meanwhile, Maren's father and many others were shown praying for her soul. Even Maren's father believed that Eek had killed his daughter. They all lit candles and prayed for Maren's peace. From a distance, Eek sat and watched everything unfold. He felt terrible because Maren's father knew him well, yet even he doubted Eek's innocence. After praying for a long time, everyone left the place. At this moment, Eek was extremely angry about everything that was happening because he knew he hadn't murdered Maren. He started pleading with God to set things right as soon as possible and bring out the truth. In his frustration, Eek even thought about jumping onto the candles to end his life. But just in time, one of his friends arrived, pulled him away, and took him home. The next morning, when Eek woke up, he noticed something strange on his face. He saw that horns were growing on his head. He couldn't understand what was happening, so he showed them to his friend. But his friend couldn't see them at all, as if they didn't exist. Instead of listening to Eek's concerns, she started talking about herself, complaining about how no one liked her and assuming that Eek had stayed at her house only because he was drunk the previous night. Now even more confused, Eek decided to visit a doctor and book an appointment to get the horns removed. He went straight to the receptionist and explained everything to her. However, she acted as if it was a completely normal issue, as if people growing horns was an everyday occurrence. She handed him a form to fill out and told him that the doctor would see him soon. As Eek sat down to fill out the form, a woman sat beside him with her daughter, who was making a lot of noise. Suddenly, the woman turned to Eek and asked, "Should I kick my daughter? She's making too much noise and bothering you." Eek, surprised, told her not to do such a thing because he wasn't feeling disturbed. After a while, Eek went back to the receptionist to check on his appointment. But before he could say anything, the receptionist asked, "Should I just kick them out since they're bothering you?" Eek couldn't understand why people were speaking to him like this. The receptionist immediately told the woman and her daughter to leave, which made the woman furious. She started banging her hand on a mirror in frustration. To calm the situation, Eek gently touched the woman's hand, and suddenly, he had a vision. He saw that this woman was cheating on her husband and secretly meeting another man. Shocked and angered, the woman stormed out of the clinic. Now, Eek was sitting in front of the woman's child, who suddenly said, "I should burn my mother alive. That's what she deserves." For some unknown reason, everyone around Eek had started speaking the absolute truth in front of him. People were also beginning to respect him in a strange way. Things were unfolding in a bizarre manner, and Eek had no idea why. For the time being, he continued with his appointment and went straight into the doctor's chamber for his treatment. He explained everything to the doctor, how horns were growing on his head and how he wanted to remove them as soon as possible. But once again, Eek was shocked. The doctor couldn't see the horns at all. It seemed like Eek was the only one who could see them. Still, the doctor agreed to help and sedated Eek before attempting to cut off the horns. A while later, when Eek regained consciousness, he saw that the doctors were busy with something else. They had tried their best to remove the horns but had failed. Eek was starting to believe that these horns were somehow responsible for the strange events happening around him. Whenever people came into contact with him, they started confessing their deepest, darkest truths. Determined to find answers, Eek went straight to his friend Lee, hoping he would understand his condition. But even Lee couldn't see the horns. That's when Eek came to a realization: maybe only bad people couldn't see them. With that thought, Eek decided to return home and talk to his mother, hoping at least his family would believe him. However, when he told his mother about the horns, she reacted very strangely. She said, "Why are you even my son? You should have died long ago." Eek had no idea what connection these events had with his life. Confused and heartbroken, he left in sadness. A little while later, his father arrived. Eek, now fed up, told him, "If you have something bad to say, just say it now." His father responded, "Why did you take Marin's life? She was such a good girl. She was even your friend." Furious, Eek defended himself, saying he didn't kill Marin. He had known her since childhood, why would he take her life? That's when his father revealed a shocking truth: he was the one who set fire to the laboratory. He did it to destroy all the evidence so that no one could ever prove that Eek had killed Marin. Hearing this, Eek was overwhelmed with rage. His father's actions had now made it impossible to prove his innocence. The real culprit was still out there, but now, all the proof was gone. Eek was furious at his family, and the strange things happening to him only made it worse. Frustrated, he stormed out and started calling Lee. Meanwhile, we learn that several news reporters were chasing him, eager to record his statement. His case had become a trending news story, and every channel wanted to cover it. For now, Eek rushed into a restaurant and sat down, waiting for Lee. Before entering, he tried to escape the reporters by telling them, "Only the best among you will get to interview me." This made all the news channels start fighting among themselves, giving Eek the perfect opportunity to slip inside unnoticed. As soon as he entered, the cafe owner suddenly blurted out, "I want to burn this entire cafe down to claim insurance money." Everyone around Eek had started speaking their deepest truths again, thanks to his strange new ability. Taking advantage of this, Eek asked everyone in the cafe if they knew anything about Marin's murder case. One man sitting nearby spoke up, saying, "I know something." Eek quickly sat down next to him, listening intently. The man revealed, "My brother is a police officer. Through his investigation, he found out that a waitress saw you and Marin together a day before the murder. When Marin was killed, that same waitress testified against you, claiming that you were the murderer and that you had forced yourself on her." With this new revelation, Eek now knew exactly who he needed to find. Meanwhile, the cafe owner, now fully convinced of his plan, set fire to his own cafe to claim the insurance money. As flames engulfed the building, Eek walked out in style, completely unfazed. He got into his car and drove straight toward the restaurant where the waitress worked. In his hand, he held a ring, the ring he had bought to propose to Marin. This revealed just how deeply he had loved her. The day before her murder, Eek had planned to propose. He had even told his friend Lee and his brother about it. Now, we see a flashback, the moment from the day before Marin's death. Eek and Marin were sitting in a restaurant, and the same waitress was serving them drinks. Eek had set up a perfect romantic moment and was about to propose. But just before he could, Marin stopped him. She looked at him with sad eyes and said, "We should break up. That would be best for both of us." Eek was completely shocked. He asked her why. He had thought of so many beautiful things to say to her, had planned this special moment for so long, but now, out of nowhere, Marin wanted to end things. What had happened to her? Marin kept saying repeatedly that we could no longer stay together and that we should separate. This deeply hurt Eek, and in frustration, he stormed out of there. That night, he had been drinking heavily, so he ended up falling asleep in his car. The next morning, a police officer woke Eek up and informed him that Marin had been murdered. Eek became the prime suspect in the entire case. In the present moment, Eek walked straight into the restaurant where he had been talking to the waitress. Due to Eek's powers of persuasion, the waitress finally started speaking the truth. She confessed that she had mentioned his name at the time because she wanted to become famous through the news. And indeed, after doing so, her name was everywhere. This revelation made Eek furious because, in her quest for fame, his entire life was being destroyed. Challenging the waitress, he declared that he had other witnesses who could vouch for him, and then he prepared to leave. Suddenly, Eek encountered his brother, Brian, who wanted to tell him something important. Brian revealed that the night before Marin's murder, he had dropped her home. Upon hearing this, Eek was enraged and started attacking Brian because Brian had never mentioned this to the police when they had questioned him. Since everyone had kept quiet, all suspicion had fallen on Eek. While holding Brian, Eek experienced visions from Brian's memories. He saw the moment when Brian had offered Marin a lift home after she left the restaurant. That night, Brian was extremely drunk and kept driving recklessly. Marin was uncomfortable with this and decided to get out of the car in the middle of a forest. Brian had tried to find Marin but failed. Exhausted, he eventually returned to his car and fell asleep. The next morning, when Brian woke up, he noticed his hands were covered in blood, and on the seat beside him was a bloodied rock. He had no idea what had happened. When he went outside to investigate, he found Marin's dead body inside the forest. Everything was too overwhelming for him. Who had killed Marin, and why was there so much blood on his hands? He realized that if any officer saw him in this condition, all suspicion would fall on him. Out of fear, Brian threw all the evidence into the water. Now, Ek knew everything that had happened that night. But one question still remained unanswered. Who had actually killed Marin? After learning everything, Ek started beating his brother badly. However, within a short time, the police officers arrived and arrested Ek, taking him with them. The next day, Lee completed all the legal procedures and got Ek released, advising him to stay safe. While talking to Lee, Ek suddenly noticed the pendant around Lee's neck. It was a cross pendant that used to belong to Marin. Ek immediately asked Lee how he got the pendant. Lee plainly told him, "Marin gave it to me." Ek was confused. Marin loved him, so why would she give her pendant to Lee? At that moment, Lee finally revealed the truth. The man for whom Marin had left Ek was none other than Lee himself. Marin was in love with Lee. This revelation completely shook Ek. His mind spiraled, and in a fit of madness, he rushed to Marin's father to uncover the truth. However, Marin's father still considered Ek to be his daughter's murderer. As soon as Ek arrived, Marin's father pointed a gun at him. Ek simply asked whether Marin had ever mentioned another man to him, but her father, consumed with rage, insisted that Marin never loved anyone but Ek. In the end, he accused Ek of brutally murdering Marin, which was why he was furious. He warned Ek to leave immediately, or else he would kill him. Completely disturbed, Ek wandered off to an isolated place, blaming himself. He couldn't understand who was truly behind everything and why Marin had betrayed him. In frustration, Ek tried to remove the two horns growing from his head, but they seemed permanently attached. Then, he suddenly noticed numerous venomous snakes slithering toward him. At first, he was terrified and backed away, but soon, he realized something. What he had thought was a weakness was actually his power. Whoever came in front of Ek was compelled to speak the truth, and by touching them, he could see their visions. All the venomous snakes began crawling onto Ek's body without harming him. It seemed as though he could control them. Instead of seeking help from the police, Ek decided to use his newfound powers to uncover the truth. A thirst for revenge awakened inside him. He went straight to the waitress who had falsely implicated him just to gain fame. She had just finished her shift and was sitting inside her car. But the moment she saw Ek, with snakes all over his body, she panicked and tried to run away. However, Ek wanted revenge. He unleashed several venomous snakes on her, and they bit her repeatedly until she died. When the police found the waitress's dead body, they immediately started tracking Ek. But with his new powers, he easily evaded them. Now, he went straight to his brother, Brian. Brian was heavily addicted to drugs and always kept a stash with him. Upon reaching him, Ek used his powers to compel Brian to consume all the cocaine and drugs in his possession. Under the influence of Ek's mysterious power, Brian ingested everything, becoming so intoxicated that he could barely see or think straight. In this state, Ek questioned Brian again, "Why did you kill Marin?" Brian, barely conscious, repeated, "I didn't do anything. I just dropped Marin off, and the next day, she was found dead." Despite all his questioning, Brian insisted he had nothing to do with Marin's murder. At that moment, Ek realized that Brian was telling the truth. He wasn't the killer. Now, only one suspect remained, Lee. The next day, Ek went directly to confront Lee. He demanded to know why Marin had betrayed him. Lee simply replied, "Maybe Marin loved me. She was ready to leave you for me." Ek couldn't accept this. Furious, he grabbed Marin's cross pendant from around Lee's neck. The moment he removed the pendant, something changed. Ek suddenly felt as though he could read Lee's mind. That's when he realized why he had been unable to see the truth about Lee all this time. It was because Lee had Marin's pendant. Enraged, Ek started beating Lee mercilessly. As he touched Lee, he began to see the hidden visions buried inside him, the truth that had been concealed for so long. In all those visions, Ek noticed that Lee had been keeping an eye on Marin for a long time. Marin was very confused about whether she could spend her entire life with Ek or not. That's why she didn't want to make a decision at that moment. However, that didn't mean she didn't love Ek. That night, when Ek stormed off in anger, Brian arrived to pick Marin up and drive her away in his car. At the same time, Lee was also there, secretly following them until they reached the forest road. Marin got out of the car and walked into the forest. Seeing that Brian had passed out drunk inside his car, Lee took advantage of the situation and went straight to Marin. Lee tried to force himself on Marin. She struggled hard to resist, but Lee was completely out of control. He believed that Marin had left Ek because of him. However, Marin made it very clear that she still loved Ek. Even after multiple attempts to stop Lee, he didn't listen. Desperate to protect herself, Marin bit his hands. Enraged by this, Lee grabbed a stone and struck Maren on the head. The blow was so severe that she died on the spot. Lee had never intended to kill her, it was an accident. But now, Maren was dead. Realizing the truth in real time, Ek was overwhelmed with sorrow. Meanwhile, Lee, furious that Ek had uncovered everything, attacked him. Every time Ek had a vision, he became momentarily weak, and Lee took advantage of this. Lee brutally beat Ek and grabbed him by his horns, confessing, "When Maren died, I framed Brian. I planted that blood-covered rock in his car to make him the prime suspect." But since Brian tried to hide everything, Ek ended up getting caught in the middle of it all. Now, Lee ruthlessly forced Ek into a car, poured gasoline over him, and set it on fire. To save himself, Ek leaped into the water just in time. Lee was convinced that Ek had died. Shortly after, the police found the burned car, and news spread that Ek was dead. No one recovered his body. In the hospital, Brian was shown struggling for his life after consuming such a high dose of drugs. However, after some time, Ek was seen alive by the shore. Though his body was severely burned, he had survived. Ek immediately made his way to Maren's father and revealed everything. The real murderer was Lee. Yet, Lee was still roaming free. The locket was provided to his father, but Maren's father returned it because one person needed it the most. As soon as that person wore the pendant around his neck, he suddenly became completely normal. His horns disappeared, and he felt much better than before. After learning everything, he went straight to his brother. He told Brian everything, how Lee was responsible for all of this. Now, it was time to take revenge on Lee. Brian told his brother that he would accompany him, but before that, he went straight to the treehouse where he and Maren had spent a lot of time together. At that place, he found a letter from Maren. It said, "Read this before I die." In the letter, Maren had written her truth, why she wanted to break up with him. She loved him deeply and wanted to spend her life with him. But she had to step back because of her cancer. If she had married him without telling him about the cancer, his life would have been ruined too. Upon reading this, he was completely shocked. This was the real reason Maren wanted to break up with him. Now, he knew everything, but Maren's murderer still had to be punished. Without wasting any time, he immediately called Lee to the treehouse. He confronted Lee and revealed that they knew the truth. He was the one who had murdered Maren. Lee desperately tried to defend himself, but the truth was already out. At that moment, Brian also arrived, and a police officer showed up, holding a gun. Brian rushed forward to kill Lee, but before he could, the officer shot Brian in the leg with a shotgun. However, when the officer tried to stop him, a misfire from the gun ended up killing the officer instead. Now, he removed the pendant from his neck, and the moment he did, large wings sprouted from his back. Within seconds, he began transforming into a devil. His massive horns grew, and his entire body was engulfed in flames. Lee frantically fired at him with the shotgun, but it had no effect. Without hesitation, he lunged forward and drove his sharp horns straight into Lee's stomach. Lee was on the brink of death when suddenly, he controlled his snakes and sent them slithering into Lee's mouth. The snakes tore through Lee's body so viciously that he died in the next moment. Finally, Maren's murderer had been punished. But he had made a grave mistake. He did not wear the pendant given to him by Maren. Because of the curse, his body slowly began turning to stone. Brian could do nothing but watch his brother die. He was completely helpless. However, little did he know that he was happily enjoying his afterlife with Maren. And with that, our story comes to an end.